Welcome to The Debate. Our discussion today, it focuses on one of the most intellectually ambitious and maybe ethically fraught comparisons being explored in modern science. It's this attempt to find parallels between large-scale human migration and the introduction of non-native biological species.
Yeah, and it's a really high-stakes, cross-disciplinary conflict. It's emerged from two major papers published almost simultaneously in 2025. First, there's parallels and discrepancies between non-native species introductions and human migration, led by Danish Ahmed. That involved, 39 authors? From ecology, sociology, political science, really diverse fields.
Right, and then came the, I'd say, necessary response, raising concerns on the dangers of linking biological invasions to human migration, led by Josie South, with an even larger group, I think 60 authors on that one.
Mm-hmm.
That's the core question, yeah.
Okay, so I'll argue that the exploration by Ahmed and colleagues isn't just valid, it's actually necessary. I think it provides a highly nuanced framework for analyzing these systemic processes, which are driven by modern globalization, by shared human activities, things that impact both migration and species movement. We stand to gain valuable analytical tools by integrating these fields, aiming for equitable and sustainable solutions. And I'm going to argue that the inherent dangers, the ethical flaws of making this analogy, they just far outweigh any potential theoretical benefits. The South et al. Paper, I think, demonstrates very clearly that the potential for harmful generalization is simply too high. It fundamentally disregards the intrinsic rights, the cultural dynamics, the, conscious agency that really define human migration. When we start using scientific terminology associated with invasion in a political context, well, it almost invariably leads to the dehumanization of migrants, and that undermines crucial social cohesion. For me, we need ethical clarity first and foremost.
Okay, let's dive straight into perhaps the most crucial point of contention then, this role of agency and ethics. The argument often made, and look, it's one I largely agree with in principle, is that human migration is, well, in most cases, an autonomous, conscious choice, right? A decision driven by economic opportunity or safety or just the universal will to thrive. Non-native species introductions, by contrast, are seen as fundamentally passive, often accidental, or at least human-mediated introductions.
Exactly. And that distinction in conscious agency, as the South paper really emphasizes, that's the ethical wall we absolutely must maintain. I mean, look at non-native species management. It's designed purely for ecological balance and control. It's codified in regulations like the EU's strict framework on harmful species. Human immigration, though, is bound by incredibly complex legal and moral frameworks, recognizing inherent rights established by states, by international conventions. To even hint at a comparison risks diluting that ethical necessity of upholding human dignity and treating migrants as rights-bearing individuals. It's dangerous territory.
I see why you rely so heavily on that distinction, conscious agency versus passive introduction. But I would argue that Ahmed et al. Are actually challenging the idea that this is some kind of absolute fixed boundary, and challenging it is necessary if we want to study the systems involved. They note that the line is actually, well, blurring in both directions, actually.
How so?
We'll take conservation, for instance. We now use assisted translocations for at-risk species. Think of the Guam kingfisher. Humans are deliberately moving species into novel areas to save them. That's a managed, intentional introduction, which kind of muddies the definition of native, doesn't it? And then look at the other side. Recent discussions around animal sentience, like the 2024 New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness. Now, that's not equating non-human animals with humans, obviously, but it does acknowledge a degree of cognitive experience. So if we concede that sentience isn't maybe exclusively human, then relying solely on agency as this absolute boundary to halt any systemic comparison, well, it becomes systemically flawed, doesn't it? The distinction feels more dynamic, not absolute. And that dynamism is what potentially allows for studying shared systemic dynamics.
Okay, but the complexity of these ethical categories, it doesn't just erase the fundamental differences in legal personhood and, crucially, the political context. I mean, even if we accept that the ethical wall is, as you say, dynamic, the practical utility of the analogy really breaks down when we look at the history of these conceptual parallels.
Which brings us neatly to our second point,
The utility of shared frameworks versus the danger of shared rhetoric. Ahmed et al. Do highlight that these conceptual links aren't exactly new. The Chicago School of Sociology, famous for mapping urban growth in the early 20th century, they use terms like invasion and succession in their concentric ring theory. And they use them to describe the movement and establishment of poorer, often immigrant groups into urban centers.
Yes, and that's a perfect example of why the comparison is so dangerous. That specific Chicago school terminology, especially using invasion and succession for social displacement, it's been comprehensively denounced, it's been replaced in the social sciences precisely because of its inappropriate, deeply prejudicial connotations.
Right. The language was problematic.
It's more than problematic. The issue isn't just that politicians misuse the language, it's that invasion science itself often employs this highly militaristic terminology that is just so easily co-opted. When ecologists talk about, say, novel weapon theory, suggesting an introduced species has some biochemical advantage native species aren't prepared for, or invasional meltdown, describing how invaders facilitate each other's spread, that language is then directly lifted and adopted to characterize human migrants as hostile, unstoppable forces. The South paper makes, I think, a critical point here. Invasion science really needs to learn from sociology's history and scrub its terminology. We need to ensure scientific integrity isn't sacrificed just for, linguistic convenience, especially given the profound ethical stakes involved.
Okay, I absolutely agree that the language needs careful revision and that the rhetoric of invasion science is problematic when applied to people. No question. But if we can strip away that problematic language, don't the structural parallels for modeling still remain robust? I mean, for instance, the success of establishment in both realms, it often depends on how well the newcomer's traits match the new environment, whether that's biological characteristics or human cultural or economic skills. Ahmed et al. Identify these structural similarities as kind of the key novelty worth exploring.
Okay, let's move to point 3 then. Scale, impact, and management outcomes. The scale of threat is often cited as a critical differentiator.
It is.
And the mechanisms of impact are fundamentally different. If you look at ecological systems, a tiny population of what they call an R strategy species, one that prioritizes rapid reproduction, lots of offspring, that can cause immediate, sometimes irreversible harm. If they have high fecundity, rapid growth, the ecological damage can be done before management can even react effectively.
Right.
With human migration, the scale of impact is entirely different. Human migrants, conversely, they typically require significant propagule pressure, as it's termed, a high number or high frequency of individuals arriving, to even be viewed as potentially destabilizing to a state. Small numbers are rarely perceived as intrinsically detrimental in the same way.
But that's precisely where the analysis becomes useful for governance, though, isn't it? While the scale of ecological impact might be driven by innate biological traits, like that R strategy you mentioned, the impact of human migration seems determined almost entirely by the host society's reaction and the resulting policy choices.
Okay.
Ahmed et al. Explore this exact dynamic. They look at historical examples where human migration resulted not in destabilization, but actually in profound economic benefit, cultural enrichment. Think of the post-World War II European migration, often facilitated, supported by specific policies linked to things like the Marshall Plan. Those policies consciously leveraged migrant skills to fill labor gaps, and that led to substantial economic growth in places like, say, West Germany. So this highlights the key divergence, really. The receiving environment in a human context has the conscious agency to manage the outcome, to utilize the potential migrants bring, or to reject it through exclusionary policies. An ecological system, outside of human intervention, doesn't possess that conscious decision-making ability. This divergence, I think, is exactly what makes the comparison potentially valuable. It helps us understand the effectiveness of different policy responses based on the values and choices of the host society.
That's a compelling argument that the comparison helps illuminate the differences in governance mechanisms. I'll grant you that. But you are describing an ideal scenario, aren't you? Where the receiving state acts rationally, ethically. The reality, as South and Tao forcefully point out, is that the perception of human migration is very rarely purely rational. It's often deeply shaped by political values, by xenophobic policy responses that frame migrants as a threat, regardless of their actual economic contribution or potential.
Yeah, that's unfortunately true in many cases.
And in the case of ecological invasions, The threat is often quantifiable, damage to biodiversity, agricultural losses. In the case of human migration, the threat is frequently manufactured, often using rhetoric drawn directly from the very biological analogies we're debating right now. And that undermines social cohesion. It leads to detrimental political outcomes. So the ethical dimension simply cannot be neatly separated from the analytical framework. It's intertwined.
But doesn't that just reinforce the need for a truly transdisciplinary approach then? I mean, if the social and political outcomes are that complex, then surely researchers need the full conceptual toolkit to model the global drivers, things like climate change, international trade, that fuel both human and non-human movement patterns across the planet.
Ahmed et al., I believe, were aiming for that kind of complex systemic modeling. They sought to understand why movement accelerates globally and how different systems respond, sort of regardless of the moving entity. Their intention, I think it was good, aiming for transdisciplinary thinking to address these shared planetary dynamics. To just stop the discussion entirely because of potential political misuse, well, it risks overlooking complex, shared systemic mechanisms that we probably desperately need to understand better.
Look, I respect the intellectual curiosity driving that exploration, I really do. But the core takeaway from the South paper, for me, remains absolutely critical. Intellectual ambition cannot and should not supersede the ethical necessity of upholding human dignity. While interdisciplinary dialogue is valuable, yes, the clear distinction between frameworks must be maintained precisely because the misuse of language by politicians, by journalists, by activists, framing migrants as invasive, it fundamentally damages democratic societies.
Okay.
We just have to accept that policy development requires context-specific, human-centric approaches that prioritize the legal rights and the complex motivations of people. While we can certainly look at systemic drivers like trade and climate change as forces acting upon both groups, we simply cannot manage human beings through the lens of species control. It's ethically untenable.
So ultimately, both papers, I suppose, highlight important areas for future research, albeit cautious research. The debate itself is evidence that academics are grappling with this difficult balance between scientific rigor and ethical responsibility.
Absolutely. And it is crucial that this debate remains civil, remains rigorous. We should emphasize transdisciplinary thinking, but not in a way that sacrifices ethical clarity.
Agreed. The discussion must continue, clearly, but perhaps the lesson from this tension is that intellectual advancement has to proceed with, well, profound ethical humility, especially when dealing with issues as sensitive as human rights and migration.